At John chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. We'll be looking through the Gospel of John chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. Let me read aloud for us. Now, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and there they stayed for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins on the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered what was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Then the Jews responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he had spoken of was his body. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. Now while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. Once again, we're starting a new series and we're going through the Gospel of John. And as I shared with you previously, John is written slightly differently in that it's not one of the synoptic Gospels. Now, the synoptic Gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, wrote their Bibles, wrote their particular books from a very historical perspective. And that's why many of their stories overlap and many of their stories follow along in terms of its timeline, because they're talking about it from a historical narrative, saying, "I remember when Jesus did this, and then after that he did this." However, John, which was the last of the Gospels to be written, was written very differently. John is following thematic themes, or stories, or narratives. So he's not trying to follow stories and bring stories together from its timeline of history, but rather, there's a theme that I want to teach you, and here are some stories as examples that affirm what I'm about to say. And we're going to see that played out here in today's chapter. But of the themes that John is trying to really get at, John utilizes what we call the 7 signs and the 7 I am to assert his biggest claim, and that is that Jesus is God. That Jesus is not an ordinary man. That Jesus is beyond a good teacher. Jesus is beyond any of the prophets. He is God himself. And he does this especially through the 7 signs, the 7 miracles that he will identify that parallel to what God had done throughout the Old Testament, as well as the 7 I am statements, which is referencing Exodus 3, where when Moses asked, "Who are you? What is your name?" What did God say? "I am who I am. My name is I am." And utilizing that same grammatical I am, Jesus reveals to the people, "I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the light of the world." And today, we learn that Jesus does indeed perform miraculous signs and wonders. And the first miracle that we find out he had performed was the miracle of turning water into wine. And we then get to read about it, but let me give you a little bit of a narrative of what happened. Jesus and his disciples were invited, as well as Mary, the mother of Jesus, to a wedding banquet in Cana, which was located in the region of Galilee. And Mary particularly seems to be very familiar and close to this married couple, because she's the one who realizes there's no more wine left. And this is very problematic. I want you to understand, weddings at that time lasted for minimally days, sometimes for weeks. I don't know if you guys remember, like, for example, Nick Jonas, when he married his wife, they had 7 weddings. So their weddings lasted for like weeks at a time. Why? Because indeed, like my neighbor, There's a wedding for the groom's side of the family. There's a wedding to invite the bride's side of the family and their friends. There's a wedding to celebrate your neighbors. There's a wedding to invite the people to the temple. Like, there's weddings that are inviting all different kinds of people. Some people stay for the whole duration. Others come only at specific times. And in a very similar manner, these weddings was lasting for a long period of time, and eventually they ran out of wine. And for many of us, we would think, who cares? But during that time, it's very problematic, because one of two things could happen. Either the master of the ceremonies, who's like the governor of the region, could either annul this wedding, saying you did not satisfy the requirements to be a properly married couple, or two is he could send a fine to the newly married couple. And the problem with receiving a fine is this, as I'm sure our engaged couple are finding out, weddings are expensive, right? Like those of us who have been married are finding out that weddings are not cheap. And so this married couple would have spent all their resources already preparing for this wedding, that to receive a fine on top of that would have been difficult to pay, and that would have meant that for many people, if they received a fine during their marriage, early part of their marriage, it would have meant that they would have gone to jail for not being able to pay. And Mary understands this reality. So she goes to Jesus and asks, please try to help this couple out. And Jesus actually initially is resistant and says, this is not my time. This has nothing to do with me. But Mary's assertive, and so she tells these servants to come and do whatever it is that Jesus commands. Jesus tells these servants that there are these 7 washing jars, these cleansing jars, and he says, fill them with water to the brim. And they do so. And he says, take some, put it into a bowl, and take it to the master of the ceremonies. And somewhere along the line, because the Bible never mentions where or when and how, but somehow the water, from the moment the water was poured in to the time in which it was given to the lips of the master of the ceremonies, something miraculous happened, and that water had turned into wine. And not just any wine, but as the master of the ceremony says, that most weddings he attends, people tend to give the best wine in the beginning and the worst wine at the end, but you had saved the best for last. So we see that this wine indeed was not just any ordinary wine, but it was the best wine possible. And what's interesting is after that, what we're told is, after having talked about the very first miracle that Jesus had performed, John goes to the story of how Jesus clears the temple courts. And this is where, once again, you have to remember that John is not following a historical timeline. And the reason why I bring this up is because in most of the other Gospels, Jesus clearing the temple courts happens in the last year of Jesus' life. So clearly, the first miracle that happened in the first year of his ministry life, but clearing the temple courts happens 2-3 years later. And we have to understand that John is not trying to be historically accurate, but he's being thematic. So what happens when Jesus clears out the temple courts? Well, what we're told is that when he goes to the temple, he sees that there's all these kind of businessmen and women. And they were profiting from the worship by selling doves and selling chicken and selling all kinds of animals that could be given over for offerings and sacrifice. This in of itself bothered Jesus quite a bit, that people were profiting off of worship. This beautiful anointed thing called worship. But secondly, what most commentators believe is what bothered Jesus was that these business people were profiting by taking advantage of the poor. Because when you're poor, you're usually working very long hours. You don't have the time to prepare an offering the way it's described in the books of Moses. So what's easier is for you to go to the temple and pay someone who's already done all the work for you. But these businessmen and women were price gouging. They're like, hey, let me charge you $10 or $20. Things that were far exceeding what was market prices. Why? Because they knew these poor people were desperate, because they still also wanted to win the favor of the Lord. And Jesus sees these two dynamics. You are taking advantage of God and of worship, and you're taking advantage of the poor in a very desperate situation, and you're profiting off those things, and Jesus gets so incensed, he gets so angry that he begins to flip over tables, he drives out the animals, he begins to throw the money into the air, and he kicks out all these business people as well. And we're told that the Jewish people come to Jesus after he has done all this and say, by what authority are you doing all this? Give us a sign, show us a miracle that shows and proves that you have the authority to do this. Meaning, who are you to judge the temple? And who are you to be the one to determine how the temple should be cleansed? Show us that you have that kind of authority. And in response to that question of show us the authority, show us the sign, and you have to remember that Jesus has already performed miracles at this point. Jesus says to them, the true sign will be that I will destroy this temple and rebuild it within 3 days. And as the gospel writer says, John says, people didn't understand until much later, after the death and resurrection, that Jesus was talking about himself, but his body. But his body would die and would rise again. And these are the two stories that we read about today. These two signs, these two miracles, these two amazing stories. And I want us to learn or think about 3 things that we can learn from these two stories about the purpose of miracles and about the purpose of signs and wonders. Number 1 is this, that Jesus reveals to us that the true purpose of signs and wonders and miracles is to reveal and glorify the greatness of God. When a miracle happens, when there's a sign or a wonder, it is to point us to the greatness of God. Secondly, it is to reveal to us what God is doing spiritually. What is God doing spiritually? Not only what is God doing within the physical of what I can see, but he's showing us what he's doing spiritually in the ways and the realms of what I cannot see. And then third and finally, all miracles point or help us to understand and see the true miracle, which is the gospel. That the truest of all miracles is the gospel itself. So let's look at these 3 things. Number 1, signs and wonders and miracles reveal and glorify the greatness of God. And we see this particularly in verse 11 being explained. What we realize through signs and wonders and miracles, and I would clarify by saying this, is that I personally, and obviously between denominations, people's views on some of these issues are going to differ. I personally believe that God still performs miracles, and that God still uses people to perform and work those miracles in this world. Okay? So, having said that, I believe that God reveals a part of his nature, a part of who he is, through miracles. And I believe this, why? Because of this basic principle of signs and wonders and miracles. That miracles are only possible because of God. Miracles are only possible because of the greatness of God. And I know that there are a lot of teachers, a lot of churches that might disagree with what I just said, but I don't believe that it is your faith, nor my faith, nor your works, nor my miracles that make miracles possible. Right? I cannot believe enough for our sister Irene to suddenly her magically her shoulder to become healed. I don't have that kind of faith. I'm not strong enough, but I believe God is. Right? So miracles are only possible not because of me, not because of any person, not because you were strong enough, not because you were good enough, not because you believed enough. Miracles are only possible because of God himself. And God, in performing these miracles and showing us these signs and wonders, wants us to see and have a taste, a glimpse of his power, of his authority, of his character, of his heart for us. He's revealing himself towards us. Miracles remind us, once again, of how great God is. And what this means, I wanted to say this, is this. What this means is that miracles, signs, and wonders were meant to help encourage us in our faith. It was not meant to be the cause or the foundation of our faith. One of the problems, right, it's interesting, because the people ask, show us signs and wonders so that we can truly believe and understand and know where you got this authority. And he won't, Jesus doesn't show them. He says, the miracle you're going to see one day is that this temple will be destroyed and rebuilt in 3 days. And yet, we're told shortly thereafter, after he leaves the temple, what is the first thing Jesus does? He performs signs and wonders and miracles. Right? So it's interesting because they're like, show us a sign or wonder. No, I'm not going to show you. You're going to have to wait and believe that the gospel is enough. And then after he leaves the temple, he starts performing miracles all over the place. Why? Because miracles are not meant to be the foundation of our faith. They encourage us in our faith because it reminds us how great God is, but they cannot be the foundation of our faith. And I'm sorry to disturb some of you guys who tend to do this, but if you, like the Jewish people in this passage, try to negotiate with God, God, if you do this, then I will believe in you, right? I'm sorry to say it's not going to happen. Because that will not cause you to believe. That's what Jesus knew about these people. If he performed a miracle in that moment, they were not going to have any greater faith or any truer faith than if they didn't see the miracle. Because miracles are not the foundation of our faith. The gospel is. Miracles, signs, and wonders encourage us in our faith, but they cannot be the cause for the foundation of our faith. Only the gospel can. And so I challenge us here to have a rethinking, a reshifting of our minds and our mentalities. Because I do believe that unknowingly many of us do ask Jesus like the Jewish people did, Lord, if you do these things for me, if you help me get this house, if you help me get this job, if you do these things, if you show your power of provision, if you show your power of healing, if you show your power of whatever it is, then I will believe. And unfortunately, brothers and sisters, there's never really been a moment in scriptures where that deal seems to work out well. Why? Because God understands that miracles never can be the foundation of our faith. It can only encourage us. But encourage us it does. And there are moments where we do need that encouragement. Secondly is this, right? Signs and wonders and miracles reveal to us not only what God is doing in the physical of what we see, but also in the spiritual realm of what we do not see. As I shared with you, John especially loves to do a parallel between the Gospel of John and his writing, especially with the book of Genesis, right? But when we see this actually with this miracle of the water into wine, why? Because when you think about the very first miracle in the book of Genesis, or in the Old Testament, is the miracle of creation. That God, out of nothing, created. And how did he create? He created with the authority that came from his word, spoken word. This is the first miracle. The first great miracle in the Bible is the first creation. And what is the very first miracle that Jesus does? We're told is the miracle of turning water into wine. How does Jesus perform this miracle? Is by simply creating out of nothing. There was no fruit. There was nothing that he used that allowed for fermentation, right? There was no proper process, nothing except this. He says, put water into this jar. And with the authority he had with his word, he turned that water into wine. Similar parallels is that we know that when God spoke, right, it happened in such a way that time itself did not make sense. Because it wasn't that God said, let there be a tree, and there was a seed planted, and eventually the seed was watered. It's that, man, when God said, let there be a tree, suddenly there was a tree. Something that should have taken hundreds of years happened in a moment. And here as well, we're told that this wine was not just ordinary grape juice, but it was the best of wine, meaning that it was like a wine that had been fermented over a long period of time. But we know this story happens in a matter of minutes. That God and Jesus, in their very first miracle, show the authority and the power they have with just simply their word. And they create out of nothing. And so, the first miracle that happens really shows us once again what God is doing, not just in the sense of he cares for this family, this married couple, but that he's revealing himself to all those that are in the banquet and to us today as well, that Jesus indeed is God, that God cared for us enough that he would come onto this earth. We'll see this in all kinds of miracles. For example, the miracle of turning the eyes of the blind to be able to see. There are many encounters of blind people that they have with Jesus, but what's beautiful to me is how different their stories are. For example, there's a story about how Jesus spits in the ground, and he takes that and makes it into mud, and he places it into the eyes of this blind person. There are other stories in which Jesus simply speaks that their eyes be opened. Sometimes his eyes of the blind open instantaneously, where something I can see, and others were told when Jesus asked them, "What did you see?" And he says, "I see like trees that are moving around, that are walking around." And it was because it was happening gradually. He was seeing people from a distance that he could not see clearly, and little by little his sight was being restored. But nonetheless, what we're told is that despite the variety of ways in which Jesus worked, in each of these stories, in each of these narratives, who was the one working? It was Jesus Christ. It was God himself. And for us as well, there is a variety of ways in which God can work miraculously in our lives. For some ways, some of us, man, as we need inner healing and we need God to comfort us, sometimes it happens miraculously as we are just alone in our prayers, and the Spirit of God comes and he speaks such words of truth and comfort, and he heals us and unwheels us from the bondages of depression and of suicidal thoughts and whatever those things might be. And yet also, God can equally work with some of us, and this is true for me, where God gives us the opportunities to have a counselor, a therapist. And in those moments, you are able to have a safe place to talk and to reflect and to process. And yet, despite the variety of ways, the reality is I experienced inner healing equally as much as friends of mine who, in their own prayer life, supernaturally experience healing as well. But my belief is, once again, is that it's still God working. It is God himself healing the hearts of his people. There are places in Africa where, man, we were like, we don't have enough food to feed all these people, and yet somehow, miraculously, God allowed all the students that came to be fed. And for us here, God gives us the miracle of being able to go to this thing called the supermarket, where you have Uber Eats and eat as much as we need. And yet, for me, whether it's just a natural way or the supernatural way, once again, it's still God working. What I love about the stories of the eyes of the blind is how diverse it is. It's not just this one way, but God shows I can work in all kinds of ways, and yet it's still me that is working. John follows up with the story about the miracle of the water into wine by talking about the miracle of the cleansing of the temple. And once again, I just want to share with you that this is to show us what Jesus is about to do in the supernatural, in the spiritual realm as well. Why? Because as Jesus was cleansing the physical temple of Jerusalem, he shows us that he was about to cleanse the true church, the true temple, which is what? The people of God, that he was about to cleanse me. But what does Jesus do in Jerusalem? He cleanses the temple of its greed. He cleanses the temple of its selfishness. He cleanses the temple of its injustice. He cleanses the temple ultimately of its sin. And what we're told is that Jesus was about to do that for you and for me, the true temple of God, the true church of God. Now what he was about to do for a physical building, he was about to do in the spiritual lives of his people. The final thing I just want to point out is this, that the truly great miracle, right, the truest of all miracles, the greatest of all miracles, is the gospel message in itself. As I share with you, when the Jews asked for the proof of Jesus' authority, They were expecting a sign or a wonder. They thought to themselves, well, I know that Jesus has turned water into wine. We know that he's opened the eyes of the blind. We know that there are people who couldn't walk that could walk. We know that there are lepers who suddenly got healed. So we've seen all that, but I wonder if there's something even greater that Jesus can do. The truest of all miracles, the truest of all signs and wonders. So they ask for it. Show us a greater sign, a greater miracle that will prove to us who you are and the kind of authority that you have. And Jesus basically tells them, I will destroy this temple and rebuild this in 3 days. And as John says, alludes to, it is a prophetic message about the gospel, about what he was about to do. As his body would be destroyed, he would die, but he would resurrect. He would be rebuilt in 3 days. The truest and the greatest of all miracles, brothers and sisters, is the gospel message in itself. I know many of us, because I have this asked all the time, especially because we're in America, like, why don't we see signs and wonders? Why don't we see miracles? And well, according to what John is saying, is you do. Because the truest and the greatest miracle of all is that Jesus died on the cross for you, and that he rose from the dead for you, and that he shares that death and resurrection up to you. Did Jesus perform the miracle of healing the blind everywhere? No. Did Jesus raise the dead in every town he went to? No. Every area had experienced different miracles, different provisions, different things. But the one miracle that was absolutely true for every town, for every city, for every person, for every soul, for every age, for every gender, it doesn't matter. The one miracle that applies to all people, because it is the truest and the greatest of all miracles, is the gospel message. So for those of us who, as I shared earlier, hey, Lord, if you do this, then I will believe. God already knew you thought that way. So you know what he does? He does the truest and the greatest miracle of all, which was that he came onto this earth. He dwelled among people. He died on the cross, and he rose again. And that, brothers and sisters, is what allows us and what causes us to believe. Because it is